Oh, good afternoon. Today our guest is Dr. Patrick Michaels. Hello, Dr. Michaels. How are you doing? Hello, Dr. Michaels. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm great. I'm a random guy who likes to consume your research. Dr. Michaels, you are an expert in the arena of climate science. What did you study as a student?
Well, I was got my bachelor's in meteorology, or not, sorry, in biology, master's in biological sciences from the University of Chicago, and then I went up to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and they designed a degree program, PhD, called ecological climatology, which put me at the interface between ecosystems and climate change. I thought it was a very exciting place to be. In late 1970s, it was actually revolutionary to hold the point of view that climate changed to the point that it affected community dynamics and ecology.
This view is still somewhat revolutionary. There are many arguing that climate has an impact on intelligence and personality, but the difference between today and the 70s is that the prevailing orthodoxy is that we human beings are the sole cause of climate change.
Yeah, that is certainly a very strange belief because, as you probably know, all these climate models, and there are dozens and dozens of them, are tuned to match the temperature history of the 20th century. This was written up in Science Magazine a few years ago. It's very interesting reading. Um, well, there are two warmings in the 20th century. The first one starts around 1910 and ends about 1945, and it's about a half a degree Celsius. So that's about half of the net warming that's been observed since 1900 of about 1 degree Celsius. Now, interestingly enough, when that started in 1910, there is no way that carbon dioxide could have been responsible for it. We didn't put enough of that stuff in the air by 1910 to have induced a half a degree Celsius warming. So that warming is much more likely, quote, natural, uh, as opposed to being anthropogenerated. And that's a pretty substantial chunk of the observed warming.
But Patrick, we often talk about CO2. Is CO2 really a pollutant? I'm familiar with the work of John Christie. Some years ago, John Christie wrote an excellent paper, and the paper was criticized, and the mainstream organization published a response arguing that CO2 is leading to warming. But other than John Christie, there are serious academics who are not involved in climate debates who are also skeptical of CO2 as a mechanism leading to global warming. So, do we have clear data contending that CO2 is causing warming, or is it just speculation?
No, I think it is causing warming
Yes.
uh, because a difficult prediction of greenhouse theory is that while the troposphere, the lower layer of the atmosphere, uh, temperature there rises, above it in the stratosphere, the temperature falls. And we've seen that. And the stratospheric temperatures are very interesting because about 15, maybe 18 years ago, they stopped falling at the rate that they were falling. And the warming, it appears to also have leveled off for quite some time. So things aren't going according to plan. Everything should be kind of going up, at a constant rate, and it's not. There's a lot of things we don't know.
Exactly. The science is never settled. If science was a settled practice, we wouldn't be talking about science. It would cease to exist.
We'd be robots.
Exactly my point. And
Yeah.
there are always levels of variation. So even, well, according to one dominant view, the relationship between CO2 and warming is not clear cut. But if the relationship is conclusive, what is the extent of warming induced by CO2? This is a completely different debate.
Exactly. And that is the position that is my synthesis is yes, CO2 is causing some warming. But the question is how much, and how much warming will there be in, say the 21st century or something like that. I think we have some guidance on that. And if we applied best forecasting practices rather than what we're doing now, I think you would come to a rather modest warming this century, which I like to call lukewarming, and I wrote a book called Lukewarming. Here's what should be done. We have these models. They're summarized every few years in something called coupled model intercomparison projects. We are now finishing the sixth of these. The modeling groups send their frozen code models, in other words, they can't be changed, to the Department of Energy, and then they're sort of summarized. And these results will appear in the various national assessments of climate change or in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Now, in weather forecasting, Lipton, you know that we just don't take all the weather forecasting models that we have, and there are probably about 8 that are easily operational globally. We just don't take all of them and divide by 8 to come up with the weather forecast. Some models are better at some things than others. For example, Hurricane Sandy a few years back was predicted by only one model to hit the United States near New York City. But that model also had the best track record with cyclones off the US East Coast. So the forecast was based upon the one model that worked. Well, in the CMEP studies, we also have one model that works, at least in CMEP 5. It tracks the vertical distribution of temperature change quite well. And it is the Russian model, INM-CM4. Now, what's peculiar about INM-CM4 is it has less warming in it than all the other models. It has an equilibrium climate sensitivity of 2.05 degrees C, which is a lot less than the average sensitivity of the CMEP models at 3.4 degrees C. So that's the model you should use. Well, now we have a new version of it, INM-CM 4.8, which has appeared in the new CMIP 6 model collection. And that one has an even lower sensitivity. That's the amount of warming you get for doubling carbon dioxide at equilibrium. It's down to 1.85 degrees C. That is in the happy zone, where I think people will generally agree that that confers a net benefit rather than a net cost, because it's accompanied by other factors, such as a massive greening of the planet that's occurring as we're speaking. That's a pretty salutary effect. And so when you calculate the social cost of carbon and you put in some of these growth factors, the social cost becomes negative, i.e., it becomes a benefit for at least into the later part of this century.
Exactly. And you produced a paper on the topic, Patrick. It's titled Climate Sensitivity, Agricultural Productivity, and the Social Cost of Carbon in Fund,
Yes.
FUND. And their co-authors are Ross McKittrick and Kevin D. Dayaratna.
Yes. And that's what we found is if you use more realistic estimates of the sensitivity and you assume a discount rate, which is, the value of money expected tomorrow, you get negative social costs of carbon pretty much everywhere, i.e. benefits. We don't emphasize that it's a benefit, and we don't make the tongue-in-cheek argument, well, if you're for a carbon tax because a carbon tax is a negative externality, are you for a carbon subsidy if it turns out to be a positive externality? No, I don't think we want to go there.
According to some studies on the carbon tax, it is so expensive that it would be better to just not have it.
I certainly agree with that. It also is ineffectual. I mean, our economist friends like to tell us that, well, the way to regulate things most efficiently is to tax them. Well, sure, but then what benefit do you get out of it? In the US, if we held our carbon dioxide emissions to put them at zero today and kept them there until the year 2100, the amount of global warming that would prevent using models that are probably way too warm is only about 0.3 of a degree. So you get all pain and no apparent gain. And, from what I've been reading, first of all, China's Xi is not going to the upcoming Glasgow UN conference to try and have people increase their commitments to reducing carbon dioxide. He's not going. They're not going to put in a carbon tax. They emit almost twice as much as we do now on an annual basis. They passed us somewhere around 2005, and they're just taking off like crazy. We are becoming an increasingly irrelevant player in the emissions game.
We notice when countries become wealthier, the environment grows in prosperity. Rich
Absolutely.
countries like America can afford to use less natural gas, although this is not something that I'm recommending, but you get the point. Environmental degradation is really a problem in poorer countries like China and India.
Yes, in fact, when countries reach a certain level of wealth per capita, then they can afford to care about the environment and they clean it up. In the United States, that happened somewhere in the 1950s. In Europe, it was about a decade and a half later. It hasn't happened to speak of in the gigantic economy of China yet. And the people there are going to be clamoring for cleaner air. The air in certain parts of China is opaque, it's not healthy, and the government knows it.
The government is aware of these disadvantages, but is the government willing to act in China? This is a different story.
Oh, I can't speak for them. They certainly have not done anything appreciable under the Paris Climate Accord. What they do is they agreed to desire to level off their emissions around the year 2030. Well, that's agreeing to nothing. People have known for a long time, as economies mature, their emissions stabilize. And many economists think that 2030 is about the time that China's economy is going to be mature enough that its emissions are going to stabilize. So they're not doing anything but business as usual. Here in the United States, we have pretty ambitious greenhouse gas reduction plans. In fact, a lot of people don't know that of all the industrial nations on Earth, the United States has cut its emissions more than any other. You hear all this complaining about the Trump administration and all that good stuff because they got out of the Paris Agreement. That didn't prevent us from continuing to cut our emissions as we switched from coal to natural gas for energy production, and also, by the way, became a net exporter of energy around the planet.
Patrick, on the topic of the carbon tax, what problem is the carbon tax solving? For one to recommend the carbon tax, or evidence must be conclusive. Is CO2 a pollutant? What are the costs associated with a world of zero emissions? These are questions that must be answered by the climate models. If there are more benefits of CO2 than disadvantages, a carbon tax is actually negating said benefit. So what is actually the purpose of a carbon tax?
Well, I think there are lots of folks in Washington that just really, really like the word tax and like to,
You're right.
to do new ones. And the way this is sold is really kind of remarkable. It's sold as a, quote, revenue neutral tax, meaning that you will have other taxes reduced based upon how much carbon tax you pay. By the way, it's a carbon dioxide tax. Let's get that right. It's not a carbon tax. Anyway, uh, you know, David Kreutzer, who was at the Heritage Foundation when there was a debate on this in Washington, D.C., said, oh, yeah. And, $3 trillion is going to walk down K Street in Washington, D.C. unmolested. Nobody's going to want to get their hands on it. Of course, he's right. It's an additional tax. It will always be an additional tax. And if the Congress voted for it, which it is not likely to, but if they did, there would be tremendous repercussions in the ballot box. Right now, the 2022 midterm elections are looking pretty bleak for the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. And the more unpopular things they do, like spending trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars that we don't have, the more likely they are to lose control.
All right then. So Patrick, the question employed was actually a rhetorical question because it's quite obvious that policymakers are not accounting for the appropriate variables in these models. As you rightly noted, politicians, they like tax.
Yeah, that's the way it goes.
They're not analyzing the issue properly. Furthermore, CO2. Is CO2 causing pollution? This is a different issue. Is it a pollutant?
That is an interesting question, because obviously CO2 is necessary for life. Photosynthesis fixes carbon dioxide and water in the form of plant material, and we either consume the plants directly or we feed it to other animals that we consume, so we're consuming it indirectly. It's hard to call that a pollutant. The argument for CO2 as a pollutant is based upon the notion that it's associated with global warming. And if global warming is strong enough or bad enough or whatever enough, then that is something that would be called a pollutant.
Laughable, Patrick. It's a laughable train of thought, but continue.
But here's the interesting part. When you ask, well, greenhouse warming, what does that look like? Well, all the temperatures don't go up uniformly. You put more CO2 in the air, and I demonstrated this in a paper 15 years ago. The more CO2 you put in the air, the more the warming is confined to the winter half year rather than the summer half year. And in fact, of all the different air masses that we have on this planet, it is the coldest air masses of the winter that are warmed up more than any of by carbon dioxide. Now, that's hard to say that's a pollutant. I mean, people move to warmer environments. They don't take all their earnings that they saved up in their so-called productive life and move to Greenland, do they? No, they move to Florida or they move to Arizona. They move to warm places. So they're trying to get away from the really cold air of winter. And that is what CO2 warms up more than anything else.
Let us disentangle some important variables, Patrick. An excessive warming is a disadvantage. However, there are benefits of global warming. Yet, in the long haul of the debate, warming by itself is not a pollutant.
Well, that's an interesting point. Human beings can live and function on this planet at temperatures ranging from minus 40 C to plus 40 C, even in excess of that. That's a huge range. And in the last 100 years, we've changed the mean value of that only a little bit under 1 degree Celsius. So very, very little. Is that something that is worth getting all that upset about? I'm not so sure. And the other thing, you go ahead.
Well, you may go ahead and I'll make the second point, but you go ahead.
So, but then there's the boogeyman scenario. The boogeyman scenario is, well, it warms up just enough in Greenland, which is not very far, by the way, from here. And a vast amount of ice falls off of Greenland. If you took all the ice off of Greenland, sea level would go up like 21 feet or something like that. So is that going to happen? Well, there is a test period called the Eemian. It was not during the current interglacial that we're in, but in the previous one. In other words, the warm period between the last glaciation and the one before that. And because of orbital dynamics, Greenland was thought to be 2 to 3 degrees C warmer in the summer than, say, the 20th century value. Well, it turns out an ice core was drilled by Dorothy Del Jensen and her crew from Denmark. And they found, looking at trace gases in an ice core that went back through the Eemian, which is about 125,000 years ago, that it was not 2 to 3 degrees warmer in the summer. It was 6 to 8 degrees Celsius warmer over Greenland in the summer. Well, that's probably warmer than we could make it. And certainly we're not going to make it that warm that long. The Eemian lasted 6,000 years. So for 6,000 years of summers, 6 to 8 degrees C warmer than today, how much of Greenland melted off? Turns out it was about 30%. While that's a substantial amount, that took 6,000 years to happen at a warming rate that I don't think we can achieve over Greenland for 500 years.
All right. And I would like to raise another objection, Patrick. Diseases. Even if warming is correlated with some diseases, then warming produces an indirect impact on pollution. If we expand pollution to include diseases. But looking at the issue logically, warming is not a pollutant. Therefore, CO2 cannot be a pollutant, because the argument is premised on the thesis that CO2 is leading to global warming, and as such, it is a pollutant because CO2 is causing warming. But if we look at the issue like a philosopher or a logician, it doesn't make much sense.
Well, I'll tell you what really doesn't make much sense. There's much more, the death rates in the winter are
I was just about to make that point.
Much higher than they are in the summer. And CO2 warming tends to warm up the winter more than it does the summer. How's that a pollutant? You're going to reduce mortality simply by warming the winter. I don't get why this hasn't come to the fore as much as is known. It's also kind of disgusting that CO2 madness has taken over the medical community. The Lancet is over in the UK is just writing horrific op-eds about how global warming is the most terrible thing on earth. And upcoming in the Glasgow UN meeting, we've got to really go to net zero emissions. We can't go to net zero emissions. Boris Johnson, the British PM, is going on about net zero emissions for the UK by 2050. Cannot be done. You don't have the technology that can replace what we have now at net zero emissions, unless you went primarily nuclear and kind of ditched solar energy and windmills because they don't produce constant power. They really make the grid unstable. But this is not going to happen. These net zero things are unachievable. They cost dozens of trillions of dollars. And I've seen estimates up to 97 trillion, by the way, for net zero by 2050. That's money we don't have. That's money that our children and your children and our grandchildren, et cetera, are going to be paying for with massive inflation if we tried to do that.
A more deceptive aspect of the blackballing promoted by the mainstream media is that we are living in a paucity of CO2.
Well, that is certainly true in terms of geologic history. We're pretty low and over the course of the last 500 million years or so. And in general, the planet was a greener place uh, before CO2 levels started to drop, which may be related to the gradual drop in global temperature that resulted when Antarctica became surrounded by the Southern Ocean with no land connection into the tropics. That just made for this big cold piece of land down there and lowered global temperature to the point where that's one of the initiating factors for the current spate of ice ages. By the way, the normal state, I hate to tell you, that we are in is an ice age now. Interglacials are much shorter than ice ages.
Exactly. And furthermore, some like to argue that because of climate change, species are declining. But the evidence is clear. We're in the age of forest expanding, biodiversity is increasing, and moreover, do we need all animals?
That's a loaded question.
No, we
There's
don't. Not
there's a
really.
there's a woman by the name of Camille Parmesan who I think was a student of Paul Ehrlich at Stanford, and she's very interested in climate change and butterflies for whatever reason. And what she has found, and this got headlines all over the world, is that butterflies were being removed from the southern parts of their range. And that, the headlines were everywhere. And people obviously didn't read the rest of her paper because it shows that the northern expansion of butterflies was much greater than the loss in the south. So actually, butterfly distribution increased as a result of perhaps increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These are funny little things that nobody wants to notice. Here's one for you. The most common agro-system on the planet are grasslands. It's where you gather the forage up into hay, or you put cows out on it or sheep out on it, and then they're consumed one way or another. We have satellite data showing how much grassland there is and how green it is. And we had 18 years of satellite data. It was published by Mounier et al. A couple of years ago. And they showed that grassland was increasing its vegetative matter by 5% per year. Now, over an 18-year study, that would be 90%. In other words, the grasslands of the world's most common agrosystem, have doubled in extent, in part because of climate change and in part because of increasing carbon dioxide.
The evidence is quite clear, Pat. I have surveyed it extensively, and I'm sure that you're more familiar with these studies than me because you're a scientist. But the evidence is clear. Biodiversity is on the increase, or forests they're expanding, and for the most part, massive climate change is not necessarily correlated with a decline in the growth of species.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting is this canard that food production is being reduced from global warming and whatever is causing that. Well, it's not. You can plot out the food production of the world's four most important crops, which are corn, wheat, rice, and soybeans. And what's amazing is that the increase since 1970 or so has been exponential. Now, you remember what Malthus said? Malthus said population growth is exponential and food growth is linear. And so there's going to be horrible, horrible problems. Well, he got it 100% wrong.
We
In
know
fact,
this.
population growth is leveling off It's certainly not exponential, and the food increase is exponential.
Yeah, we're aware of the data. Food production is on the increase. H.
Yep.
Sterling Burnett, I quoted him yesterday, is doing a terrific job at educating us. And droughts are no longer a major problem. Lastly, extreme wealth tames extreme weather.
Well, that's exactly correct. But one of the things you can do uh, is, as Roger Pilkey Jr. has done at University of Colorado, he takes global GDP data and looks at weather-related losses as a percent of global GDP. Now, the GDP data comes from the UN, and the losses come from the big reinsurance companies who have every reason to study what their risk is. You have data from Munich Re and Swiss Re, and Pilkey shows that the weather-related losses in GDP are going down. They're becoming less and less a percentage of GDP as time goes on. How about disaster-related mortality? Things like people dying in hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. That's down 99% since 1900. That's a remarkable civilizational achievement to have reduced weather-related deaths by 99%.
It's just unfortunate that people are not consuming the data as ferociously as the experts like yourself.
Well, that's a
Well, they don't
compliment.
have the time. They don't have the time, obviously, but the mainstream press, I tell you, these journalists are so inept at their job. Maybe they are actually adept because they want to make money, but I have very little respect for the mainstream agenda.
Well, tell me this, what gets more clicks? The world's going to come to an end in 10 years, or it's getting a little warmer, so what? You tell me.
The
It's the
word,
first.
exactly, the former.
And so we built up sort of an informational culture of apocalypse. Unfortunately, I'm so old, I think I've lived through 9 environmental apocalypses, starting with the population bomb or something like that. None of them ever come true. And I would say, if I were a betting person, which I am, that I would go short on apocalypse futures.
You're exactly right, Michael. There are like a million articles online saying that the apocalyptic predictions have failed and will continue to fail.
Yes, they are
It,
there.
it doesn't make much sense. And the best case study is the example of the wager between Julian Simon and that
Oh, yeah.
academic from Stanford, Paul. Julian Simon won.
Yeah, that's right. The bet was whether certain commodities would become much more expensive because of resource depletion. And Simon, who was a very skilled thinker, knew that couldn't be the case because the human ingenuity is
It's
just
infinite. It's yes.
remarkable. And he lost. I mean, Paul Ehrlich lost the bet and paid up, and still hasn't changed.
No.
Nor
The
have the people from the Club of Rome, who wrote the Limits to Growth in 1972. In that one, we were going to be out of air, oh God, about 20 years ago. And certainly starvation would be everywhere, et cetera. Those reports are just wrong. And yet they cling to them. They say, oh, well, we just called it too early. It's just around the corner. Just believe us. Just listen to us. It's really too
Pat,
bad.
Patrick, eco-pessimist, are they aware that the term climate change is value neutral? In other words, if the climate is changing, we can either encounter advantages or disadvantages. So, for example, in spite of climate change, arable land will increase. Climate change is a value neutral term. So, when you say mitigate against climate change or adapt, you're not really saying much because it's a value neutral term.
That's right. And also, it's always around, with or without human beings putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I assure you, there have been some pretty dramatic climate changes that are as recent as about the wink of a geologist's eye. Remember, 20,000 years ago, there's more than a mile of ice over what's now the city of Chicago. You go a little bit north of there, and it got to be about 2 miles thick. We have this anomaly in the northern hemisphere called Greenland, where the ice goes all the way down to 60 degrees latitude, which is really far removed from the pole. That influences the climate, and we have large circulations in the Pacific, like the Pacific multi-decadal oscillation and all these polysyllabic oscillations and climate around the Earth. It's always changing, it's always in flux, and it will never be stable because the Earth's surface is heterogeneous, and the amount of radiation that falls upon the planet is not the same everywhere. The winds blow from west to east, and you can see the mountains of the world distort the wind pattern, create great storms. It's just a hugely dynamic system. It's fun to watch. I'll tell you that. I really am glad that I made this my business.
It's similar to the history of mass extinctions in Australia. Mass extinctions, according to some studies in Australia, were driven by climate change, but this nature of climate change was not induced by human activity.
I would offer another hypothesis that the extinction of the Australian megafauna was a human deal.
That the human what?
Was caused by humans, by overhunting, Aboriginal overhunting. I've heard that in several places.
Yes, I've also heard that, but that is not climate change. And
oh, heck no.
Yeah, exactly.
No. But one thing is, how did the Aborigines get to Australia?
Brilliant question. As my friend who's a doctor said, wasn't that form of migration a response to climate change?
Yes, it was, because the sea level dropped during the Ice Age. And now something that's just come out rather exciting in the last couple of weeks is it looks like human beings got into North America about 30 or 40,000 years ago, which is much earlier than people thought. And it's because the sea level was down enough that you could essentially walk across the Bering Land Bridge and get into the warmer climate once you got out of the north.
Wow, so without climate change, we wouldn't have modernity.
No, of course not. And think about how much of our way of life actually centers around the fact that left alone, without clothes and without shelter, human beings can tolerate only a very, very narrow range of temperature. So we built these structures which turned into cities. We build technologies to change the temperature of the structures that we live in. We clearly not only adapt, but prosper because of climate change.
So Patrick, if climate change is so pernicious, then activists should tell us what are the benefits of a static climate?
Yeah, I don't think that they could come up with a pretty good answer. But also, the climate people, activists, remind me kind of like Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide.
Yes.
They think that any change in temperature is bad. In other words, that absent human activity, we lived in the best of all possible climates. Well, I don't think that's true. There are a lot of economists that think that a few degrees of warming is probably net benefit. Uh, to say that the climate of old is the perfect climate is just Panglossian.
A world without humans, can we envision it? No. Human beings are intelligent creatures. We enrich the quality of the environment. In a world inundated with animals, pollution will be a big issue, a dangerous issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, the quality of life, quality of the environment in American cities prior to the development of the automobile was hideous, especially in the summer. Horses eat a lot and poop a lot, and
Exactly.
that doesn't go anywhere. It must have just been a horrific miasma in the tenements of New York City back then.
Patrick, do you know why humans are so seminal? Let me tell you why. Because human beings have pacified dangerous animals. Without the domestication of animals by humans, many of these creatures by now would be monsters and they would be eating each other.
Well, that's certainly possible, but I mean, you know, there's the human activity, human influence on the planet has been an interesting object of study for some time. Around, I think, 1950, there was a book published called Man's Role in Changing the Face of the Earth. It's a very famous geography text. People have been aware that we exert quite an influence on our planet. I mean, when you take a forest and turn it into a city, that's what happened in Washington, D.C. The local temperature and physiography changes dramatically. I don't know if you know this thing that you obviously have heard of called the urban heat island, where cities are warmer than their surrounding countryside. One of the largest urban heat islands that I know of is, in fact, Washington, D.C. Nobody can quite figure out why it's so large. My guess is it's the waste heat from all the money changing hands.
Waste heat from the money changing hands.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's our money.
yes, I'm remembering Anthony Watts. So Anthony Watts did a presentation once, and he said that many of these climate studies they are assessing data close to heat sinks.
It, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch what
No,
you said at the end.
Anthony Watts, he was in a
Yeah.
presentation once and he said that many of these studies exploring climate change and warming, they're actually assessing data close to heat hotspots.
Yeah, well, here's an interesting thing. You remember all the news a few years back about the so-called pause, end quote, in global warming because
Yes.
many of the surface temperature records didn't show anything. Well, right before the 2015 Paris conference, which was where the Paris Accords were going to come out of, all of a sudden, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration changed the temperature record. And they put warming in where there was a pause. And the way it was done was a little shaky, to say the least. Their methodology guaranteed that it would put warming in data that didn't have any. And so these temperature records are funny. Here's how bad the situation becomes. You know that if you stick a thermometer in a glass of ice water and you make sure the fluid keeps moving, that the temperature will stay at freezing until all the ice is gone. That's physics 101. Now, we don't have much temperature data over the Arctic Ocean, but what was done recently, and this is now in all the temperature records, is we take the stations that are the northernmost land stations in our hemisphere, like Resolute on Baffin Island, some places in Greenland, et cetera. And we extend the reach of those stations, like Barrow in Alaska, hundreds of miles out into the Arctic Ocean. Well, land temperatures change a lot more than water temperatures. And if Barrow has 10 degrees above normal in a July, and you extend that out over the Arctic Ocean, you're going to be making a tremendous error because the Arctic Ocean has a lot of ice in it and a fair amount of wind, and it's stirred up quite a bit. The surface temperature over the ice-choked Arctic Ocean is going to be at freezing until all the ice disappears. But we're taking land records and extending them out where there's still ice, and obviously putting warming in there that's not there.
It is quite dubious. Well, a fabrication cannot be dubious. That would be redundant, but you get the point. It's a fabrication that many people believe.
Well, it's because there are so many different human factors involved here. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of climate models, and they can't all be correct. In fact, there is one that's correct. It's the Russian model, and it produces less warming than any of the others.
But Patrick, let's get back to the pause for a while.
Sure.
The skeptics of climate change, and when I say skeptics, I am not referring to people like yourself. I am talking to those right-wing pundits and commentators who don't believe that the climate is changing. They employed the pause to indicate that climate change is not real. But my contention is just a bit simple. I'm not going to say nuance because it is an obvious observation. If the pause in global warming is real, this is a consequence of climate change. The climate is changing. Several variables are likely to be realized.
That's correct. Before the pause was disappeared, I think Anthony Watts kept a running total of how many different explanations there were for it in the refereed scientific literature, and it got to somewhere near 60. And you have about 60 different explanations for something. I assure you do not know what you're talking about.
Exactly my point. And Patrick, I must admit, I am not a scientist. I dropped science a long time ago, Patrick, but I have common sense.
Yeah, well, it's common sense to say, well, if we have the forecast of so much warming, how much has it been warming? And interestingly enough, the new suite of climate models called CMIP6 has a lot of models that were warmer than the previous suite. But as Zeke Hausfather has shown, the warmer the model is, the larger the errors that it makes in recent decades. So those warm models can be just discounted. Even climate hawks like Gavin Schmidt from NASA have gone public and said, yeah, we don't know why the models are running too hot, but we've got to do something about it.
You are a prophet. I was just about to discuss this article. So Naked Capitalism is an excellent publication, and Naked Capitalism is actually skeptical of climate skeptics, but there's an article published by Naked Capitalism titled "Some New Climate Models Are Projecting Extreme Warming. Are They Correct?" And it was published in 2020. And I quote, "For example, a study released April 28 evaluated the past performance of the models making up the CMIP6 ensemble. The team assigned weights to each model based upon historical performance of their warming projections, weighing the poorer performing models less. By doing so, both the mean warming and the range of warming scenarios in the CMIP6 ensemble decreased, meaning the warmest models were the ones with weaker historical performance." And then there's another point. In fact, a new study addressing the increased sensitivity was published in Science Advances, stating cloud feedbacks and cloud aerosol interactions are the most likely contributors to the I values and increased range of ECS sensitivity in the CMIP6.
Yes.
On some,
And
yeah. I have a slight speech impediment. Forgive me about that, but you can go ahead and make your point.
I was just saying, you know, messing around with climate models is common. Uh, there was a paper, news report in Science magazine right before the 2016 election. I don't think that was a coincidence, that scientists were now being candid about how the models were, quote, parameterized. That means the fudge factors we put in the model to get the answer we want to get. In fact, the paper in question said, well, actually, we tune the models to get a result that's in, I'm quoting from this paper, in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, we tune the models to get the anticipated acceptable result, end quote. What does that tell you? That tells you this is all subjective. And, the modeler has an idea. And if the model doesn't say what the idea is, what do? We change the model, not the idea. So there was a story related in the Science magazine piece about the Max Planck Institute model being contributed to the CMIP-5 model collection, which is the penultimate one. CMIP-6, by the way, is not absolutely complete yet. But anyway, the Max Planck folks had to submit their model to the CMIP project, which is run by the Department of Energy, and what's called a frozen code, which means this is the model, you can't screw with it. And it gave a warming and equilibrium climate sensitivity of 7 degrees Celsius. And they're quoted in Science magazine saying, we had to get that down. And so they were looking to ways to tune the model to get it to correspond more to other models. Well, this is groupthink writ large. And this is not science determining an answer, it's scientists determining what they think should be the answer.
Equilibrium climate sensitivity, the amount of warming we're to expect if CO2 were to increase, it is on the lower side of the scale.
Well, here's the thing. How do you calculate the equilibrium climate sensitivity? Well, the definition is that's the amount of warming you should get when everything bounces out of the system for doubling atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's a figment of imagination. And the way that it's calculated is to take a climate model, sorry about this, take a climate model and run 4 times CO2 in it, let it come to equilibrium and divide by 2. And that's the answer.
Yes, but most people are not familiar with the term ECS. And well, to be honest, Patrick, I've only seen this term in academic publications or when I read the Heartland Institute or listen to a scientist on YouTube.
Yes.
Yes, ECS is not important to the average person, but for the purposes of scientific research, it is important. And according to the better studies today, it is not on the upper side of the scale.
That is correct. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my voice here.
But then again, Patrick, what is the optimal level of warming? We don't know.
That is a guess. I'm sure that there are some economic models that say it's about 3 degrees C or 2.5 when it would turn from a benefit to a cost. But again, though that's heavily dependent upon assumptions, as we showed in that paper with Kevin Diaratna and Ross McKittrick early in 2020. Is very easy to generate a negative social cost of carbon just by using lower sensitivity and perhaps more realistic estimates of the greening of our planet happening directly from CO2.
Now, Patrick, we're wrapping up and you're going to briefly tell us about your observations concerning the newest IPCC report.
Well, the report itself is massive. It's quite complete. And what it is a gigantic literature review. Well, guess what? That scientific literature is generated um, by government-funded science, which has a point of view. And so even if the IPCC report is accurate in the way that it summarizes the science, it's going to be a biased summary because, nobody ever got their grants extended by saying this isn't a problem. I assure you of that. The way to keep going on in the business is to say it's worse than we
Inflate
thought.
climate change.
What's that?
Inflate climate change.
Yes, of course. And unfortunately, that creates serious problems. I'll give you, I'll close with an example of the rot in this profession. In the year 2000, the U.S. Global Change Research Program produced something mandated by law, a national assessment, end quote, of global climate change impacts on the United States. And they used two different computer models. In my review of it, I asked the models, how much variance could they reduce just calculating simple 10-year running means of temperature over the 20th century? And it turns out applying the models to the temperature data increased the variance. That's exactly the same as taking a 4-choice multiple choice test and getting less than 25% correct. The model actually added noise to the data. And I wrote that to the head scientist for this report. It was a friend of mine by the name of Tom Carl. And he wrote back and said, yeah, you're right. And it's not just at 10 years, it's at 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20, 25 years. It's at all periods. The models add more noise to the data than exists in the raw data. Using that to create a report of major policy significance sure sounds like science malpractice to me. What do you think?
It is. It is science malpractice because you quoted Roger Pierkel. He said that climate catastrophism is unlikely. So it is scientific malpractice on many levels. What they're concluding is inconsistent with the data. And we do know that some of these scientists are fudging the data. Do you remember the East Anglia scandal some years ago?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
The ClimateGate emails. Those
Exactly.
are a laugh riot.
Yeah, so we know that they're dishonest. And the independent, was it the Independent Institute or the Cato Institute? I read the article. Maybe it was the Independent Institute. The Independent Institute some time ago published an article on the political economy of climate change, arguing that politics is driving research. It was published around 5 or so years ago. But before we go, I'm going to end with this note, and it's from a paper you wrote titled "The Scientific Case for Vacating the EPA's Carbon Dioxide Endangerment Finding." And you write, in a 2016 review of the enhancement literature, the noted agronomist Bruce Kimball found that the most exciting and important advances in regard to CO2 enrichment are the large yield responses of hybrid rice. The findings are indeed encouraging for the prospects of breeding rice varieties that can respond with higher grain yields at the elevated CO2 concentrations expected in the future. And these are my last words. Patrick, it was a pleasure to speak to you. I really enjoy our conversation, and I hope that one day, when you're interviewed on Fox News by Tucker, the discussion can reach this level.
Yeah, well, you ought to take a look at my interview with Mark Levin. I did his show a couple of years ago, and it was terrific. He's really, really good. Go check it out.
All right. Still a pleasure speaking to you. All right, bye.
Bye.